All right, welcome everyone to the final panel of the day. And thank you for toughing it out. I'm sure you're all tired by now, having heard all sorts of cool and interesting things that I haven't heard because I only just arrived. But I'm a bit jealous, I have to say. On the other hand, I got to see the coolest pizza place in Salem with my kids.
Oh.
The Flying Saucer Pizza. It has, in Salem Center, it has the most amazing pizzas and all sorts of geeky stuff like Star Trek and Star Wars. So if you have a 15-minute ride with a car over there, do it.
It's the first time in America, or in the U.S.
Yeah, my kids, yes, absolutely.
Awesome.
So, it was a very American pizza place, so my place to live. Enough about that. We have two presenters and lots of time, and I'm sure you're interested in their topics, so I'm going to stop talking about my kids and give the floor to Samara. I'm going to give both of you 20 minutes each, because we have oodles of time, and then we'll open up the floor for questions when you're both done. So whenever you feel ready.
Wonderful, wonderful. My name is Samara Hayley Steele, and I'm an advanced research affiliate with the Humanities and Critical Code Studies Lab at USC. I've been doing that for a good 2 years now, working under the lab director, Mark Marino. Our work is to explore, create, and document emerging media forms. And the creative methodologies that have sprouted up in the 10 years since critical code studies came into existence are the annotation of code, and so that's like code as manuscript, and or code as I can't remember code as manuscript, code as document, the reading of code and the annotation of code. So, it started with people looking at computer code, and 2 years ago I had this crazy idea that certain kinds of Larp are actually what may be thought of as code that runs on humans. So we started annotating some Larp code, and that sort of led to this process of looking at mechanics in this, very different way. But in my discussion, my talk on Thursday, I was looking at Larp literacy, and so this is sort of going into some of the mechanics that aren't all necessarily coding, because it's certain kinds of Larp that have Larp code. This talk is about diegetic democracy in Larp design, techniques for distributing power over what we see, and these are notes towards a paper. So my goal is to be a little less formal, and kind of show some ideas that I'm in the midst of developing, and I'm really excited, for folks who I know are designers in the room, to give thoughts and feedback, or if I'm, if you're like, no, that just doesn't make sense, like I want to hear about it in the Q&A. So please, I'm excited to make this more of an experience of co-creating things. So in this talk, this is a discussion about power over diegesis. How do we hold power over diegesis authorial in some media forms, and how might it be rendered aggregate? This has been an interest of mine for quite a while, since working on aggregate Larps in the Pacific Northwest. For this talk, I'm drawing from terminology from narratology, semiotics, critical code studies, communication studies, media studies, and theories of decentralization. I'm looking at 3 specific Larp styles and their mechanics. So the Pacific Northwest aggregate Larps, some of which I worked on, and also that I've been documenting, working with their creators to document those styles of Larp. Some mechanics from Nordic Freeform Larp, I'm really limiting it to about 2 mechanics, and some mechanics from Irvine GM-less Larp. So the central question I'm interested in looking at is, how might these efforts to democratize power over diegesis in Larp be instructive to those interested in new and experimental forms of horizontal governance? So how might we take the ways that we co-create diegesis in Larp and use it to talk about other decision-making processes which I argue, in whether it's legislative or, consensus processes or whatever, any decision-making process, you're creating a story. You're creating a story about the future. So how might we think of, LARP as a media form that might be instructive to talking about how we distribute power in those other forms of decision-making? So, towards a more democratic medium. Something that's very interesting to me about these two quotes is that they both were, they came out in '67. It was kind of interesting to take a moment and say, oh wow, this was right at the cusp of the sort of cultural revolutions we saw in the West in '68. The medium is the message. The birth of the reader must be ransomed by the death of the author. That's McLuhan, that's Roland Barthes. So, how is LARP, in a way, fulfilling some of the work of the post-structuralists, the work of the early four founders of media studies? Our media train us in directing our attention. And the question I ask again and again, is our attention being trained up towards authority, or is it being trained around towards each other? And how do our media guide us in that training? So, quick terms you'll want to know before we get too far into these mechanics. Diegesis is the story world of a given piece of narrative media. LARP is a gaming medium through which players co-create diegeses, or story worlds, through two ways: acts that directly represent diegetic material, and through gamified deployment of diegetic signifiers. So, if you only have direct diegesis, you have immersive walkabout theater. You have to have some form of gamification of diegetic signifiers intermixed with your direct diegesis if you want to have a LARP on your hands. So the way different LARP communities gamify diegesis is what's really a focus here. So some of you might be familiar with Barron's model of decentralized communication from 1964. And that's sort of a model for thinking about how people's attention might be directed by a piece of media. Do you have an authorial media? So, author, authority, very similar words there. Or do you have a more aggregate piece of media? The analogy for the authorial media form, the book. You have a centralized figure who's directing your imagination. You can't choose whether or not Huck Finn gets on that raft. There is an author, there is an authority over what is true in the narrative diegesis. In a more aggregate piece of media, you have a degree to which those who may be considered spectators have control over whether Huck Finn gets on that raft. An analogy for, an aggregate piece of media, for LARP anyway, I'd say it's like a combination. If you have aggregate LARP going on, you've got a combination between social media and open source software as analogies, depending on what you've rendered aggregate as part of your LARP. So, authorial LARP, it's more centralized. Players are looking towards a director. They're like, what is my character thinking? And I want to make sure folks know I'm not knocking authorial LARP. I really value that we have that experience, but you are looking towards an authority to direct your play. LARP makers tend to focus, it's the default for Western culture. You don't need to build new social apparatuses to teach people to stare at one person in the center of a room full of people. How funny that none of us had to do any special training to have this interaction that we're having right now. However, with an aggregate LARP, special apparatuses need to be built. They need to be workshopped. People have to figure out how to not look towards the central authority to get story, and and so that's why I say, at the bottom, you can hold the power over the diegesis authorial, or you can build the apparatuses to render it aggregate. You have to render it aggregate. It's not automatic. Let me see. So to jump right into the mechanics. We are going to look real quick at Pacific Northwest Aggregate LARP. I spoke about it during the Boffer LARP panel I was on earlier. I got to do some rules design for Beyond the Ether during the run of that game, which was one of a couple aggregate style LARPs that emerged in that area at that time. Gonna look at Freeform, gonna look at Irvine style. A rules engineer for that is here. Yay, Evan. I really want to, hear from you if we have time at the end during the Q&A. But let me see. So rules and content aggregation. So I feel like I'm gonna go back and forth with my slides here. Yes, photos. Okay. Yes. So Pacific Northwest Aggregate Larp. I'm going to summarize it real quickly, especially for folks who were in the panel earlier. So in diegetic commodity Larps, don't have time to really jump into that term, into Larps where you have big books of rules that you got to memorize, where before you even get out and can start co-creating Diegesis, you need to know what a fireball is and know what to do if someone says 20 agony and throws a beanbag at you and it hits you. You have to have that all memorized, front-loaded, before you're even out on the floor co-creating Diegesis. So diegetic commodity Larp. There is a sort of tradition from the 80s of having, these sort of centralized committees, many of whom are located in New England, oddly enough, that will create and license rules out that are used all over the country. I was part of of Alliance Larp in the early 2000s, and we, we're a franchise that licensed the rules from the Alliance HQ out here in Boston. And there's this interesting phenomenon where, with this style of Larp, diegetic commodities do render Diegesis very aggregate, very much democratize it, decentralize it. Players are able to wander around without a GM and co-create story together. I can heal you, or cast a dragon's breath, or do some magic spell on you, using this big set of rules. So it seems really flat structured, non-hierarchical at first, but as you start playing these games, you realize, wait, who's making these rules? Where are these decisions coming from? Oh my gosh, if we want to change one rule in our chapter, it takes 4 years of going through this really, it's pretty cool. No, it's not. The tactic, I think based on many years of some members of that community in the Pacific Northwest being fed up, new forms of Larp were created. Embodied in Devia, 2009 was when that was launched, and Beyond the Ether, 2012 through 14. So this style of game, Pacific Northwest Aggregate Larps, some key things about them were that I'd say that the big change we made was that we let the players design the rules. The rule book suddenly went from being 250 pages to being these 13 pages, 28 pages. That's how long the rule books, the core rules were for these games. Brian Gregory came up with the, if you've ever done Ruby on Rails, you'll know they have these, what are the conventions, methodologies, and the coding methodology for this is separate core rules from setting. You want your core rule book to be separate, and it's amazing how when you make that design choice, to say, all right, we're going to have a core rule book, and this rule book, rather than telling people what the rules are supposed to be, we let players create the rules. Suddenly, if I want to have a character who's a magician, it's all right, here's the half page about what it means to create a rule that has a beanbag throw. So I can say, I want a rule where I turn people into rabbits, and they'll work with staff to create that rule, and you have a sort of, democratic sense of every member of the Larp being able to come up with rules that are specific to their characters, that work in a way that everyone can understand. So that was one of the many changes we made to sort of democratize the process of being in a diegetic commodity Larp. We also had an endpoint for those games to avoid the hierarchies that can be established. There's another major problem of this style of LARP is you do get levels of hierarchy in which players who have been playing for 8 years can run around and, you know, fight big monsters, and players who haven't been are dependent on them for protection. And we wanted to avoid that way of centralizing story and of centralizing what happens in the game. So creating a scenario where after 1 year you end the Diegesis completely. It's gone. Sort of eliminates that hierarchy. So you prepare everyone. You say, all right, you know, this game ends after a year. So these were, you know, design choices that allowed a different player interaction with Diegesis and decentralized it in a way. So narrative consensus. So transitioning to like a very, very, very different style of gamifying co-created play. So say you're not in a diegetic commodity LARP. Say you're in a Nordic Freeform, but you know, I was having some conversations with people this weekend about other forms of cooperative and consensus-based LARPs that have emerged, you know, and kind of outside of this context. But the Nordic Freeform, narrative consensus mechanics, essentially you're pausing the game and having your players reach consensus about what happens next, and then resuming the game to act it out. You know, you don't really have diegetic commodities. Nothing happens to your character that you didn't consent to, or that you don't consent to throughout the game. So you might decide before the game what you want to have happen, or you know, the goal is to work to co-create a story with other characters. So you're going to have sort of a front loading of workshops on consent and consensus, so that you're prepared to be in a non-competitive mindset, so that you're ready to have this sort of engagement with a character based on a term that comes from Swedish LARP making called inlafse, where your sort of psychological and emotional experience of the character is privileged above all else. So I'm approaching that game, you know, rather than from a competitive mindset, from a mindset of consent, and saying, you know, I'm going to have this character go through an arc. I'm going to design all of the ups and downs that character is going to feel, and everything that happens to my character in that game, every last thing, is going to be something I want to happen. And they have sets of mechanics to make sure that occurs. One of the main ones is pausing the game to work out as a group what is supposed to happen next. And one of them is sort of throwing ideas out of character and modifying them based on each other's reactions. So New World Magic Skola is a Nordic Freeform LARP that has transplanted some of these concepts, brought them to the United States. And what's been interesting in Maury Brown's writings about her work or running New World Magic Skola games is that there is a level of consent process and training that has to be workshopped, and calibration that players have to learn in the United States that isn't present in the places these games originated, or that the learning isn't present. Let's say the culture is present. People already kind of know how to have these interactions in a way that they didn't in the U.S. So there's been a lot of work in building the mechanics to help create this style of gamifying the Diegesis. And so there's an 8-page code of conduct policy for this game, which is very neat. But that's sort of one of the, almost like a rule book in a way, because once you have a firm code of conduct and players feel safe from types of problematic behaviors, and they understand that they can set their boundaries, and they understand that, they're building their character's story in a certain way. Once they realize where they can set their boundaries, they're able to go a lot further into what it is that their character is supposed to do in the game. So very quick gameplay example to give you an idea of what this might look like. So let's say there's just been a werewolf attack in the school halls. Players lying on the ground and appears to be injured. Another player approaches and they have an out-of-game conversation. So the first thing that, player number one says, they'll say off game. So can I see any injuries on you? And the other, player two just might say, yes, there's a big bloody giant scratch and it seems to be glowing with green light. Number one, well, my character wants to be a healer and she's really anxious about doing things right, but I want her to mess up. So would it be okay if she tries to heal you and just really screws it up? And number two might be, oh my gosh, that's perfect. Okay, I really want to try playing with an impairment, so how about you heal me and I lose my voice? And number one might say, oh my gosh, I like that idea, but wait, what if instead you can't see? So other players have to guide you around. Number two, that wouldn't be fun for me. I think I just want to lose my voice. Number one, gotcha, I like this plan. So they've established a plan off game, and once it's established, they'll go back into character. They've got their magic wands, and the healing happens. So that's sort of looking at that mechanic and how it looks. Diegetic bartering and randomization. This is a technique developed in the Irvine GMless Larp community. I was very excited to encounter it 2 years ago at the LA Freeform Society, where Evan Shower brought that as one of our monthly game jams. And this technique, you have diegetic bartering and randomization techniques replacing the role of GM. So it's based on, I believe, the indie LARP maker John Wick, who developed a tabletop GM-less LARP that has somewhat similar mechanics and diegetic feel to it. It creates a type of decentralized secrets and powers LARP, or parlor LARP. No diegetic quantities in this game. The examples, Port of Secrets and Blood and Tears. Those are the two pieces you really want to look at if you want to learn this rule system. And Evan is going to be running Port of Secrets Saturday night at 10. So, this style of game, I'd say it feels like playing poker with the Diegesis. And it can feel really weird. I'd say that, there's pitfalls in every type of game. The pitfall to watch out for with this is like diegetic instability vertigo. The sense where you're like, okay, so I walked into this game playing this police officer and the mobster I was after just transformed me into his mother, and now like I just had my backstory changed again, and that person, it's like all of these things about the game can change really randomly based on like how players leverage a type of power that they gamble with. So everyone starts out with an equal number of chips, and you can bribe people into changing the Diegesis, and if they don't accept your bribe, there's a competition mechanic that might let you make the diegetic thing that you want to have happen to the other person, and it's involving dice, so it's not skill based. It's just very easy for anyone who may not have the hand-eye coordination to throw a diegetic commodity out there. But it's yet another exciting way of decentralizing the Diegesis. Here's some photos from the run. It lasted a good 3 hours, and the character information, 2 pages, character sheets were this long. Like pickup time for this LARP was literally 20 minutes. It was amazing to get into a game where I'd say all players felt equally confident to co-create Diegesis within about 20 or 30 minutes. My quick, I guess to sort of pull together, if one is preparing to create an academic syllabus of Larp studies, or you're teaching Larp as literature, which I'm really excited to do in the future, I would say that if you want to teach a decision-making structure that mirrors socialism, teach diegetic commodities Larp, and teach the standard style, and also, show off Pacific Northwest aggregate Larp, show off types of Larp that localize those structures. If you, want to teach consensus process like anarcho-syndicalism, the way things are in Basque Country, the Mondragon cooperative, like worker ownership, what does that look like? How does it feel to be in a situation where you have no tyranny of the majority, where one person can block the entire group from doing something? Give Nordic Freeform Larp a try, give narrative consensus a try, and teach it to your students, and pull that in with readings and whatnot about that style. Irvine GMless Larp, I'd say it mirrors parts of capitalism. The narrative you were counting on could go bust at any moment, and it's the Larp that I've encountered so far that kind of engages some of those political economic mechanisms. Game designer perks, diegetic commodities Larps will let you hunt people, the other two won't. Narrative consensus, you get the enlace, the emotional connection. Diegetic bartering, you get impromptu theater prompts. These are the things that each type of Larp gives you that the others don't. I would argue that maybe that's not the case, but I'd like to discuss that through during the Q&A. But to get these features all with relative autonomy from the game staff, this took amazing effort on the parts of Larp makers to render these styles of games aggregate. So I'm just very impressed with their work. I'd say I'm just gonna, so I'm of the belief that game literacy is a vital feature for a well-functioning democracy. I'm excited to see a student population that encounters more rule sets and learns how to talk about and reflect upon those rule sets and how it made them feel to play that type of game. So I look forward to a more advanced Larp studies curriculum in future academic courses. So. Right.
So I'm going to be talking about process philosophy, so be warned, this might get a bit intense. And I should warn you, I have a stammer and I'm a bit jet lagged, so I probably am going to stammer at some point during this talk. And in fact, I was going to start off talking about something else, but I might start off talking about my stammer and the way that it's affected me in my life. So it's really difficult for me to sit here now and speak to all of you people. It's taken me a long time to get to this point. I developed a stammer when I was about 13 years old, which is really unusual. And the lingering memories I have from that time are of being picked on, being made fun of by people in school, of going to speech therapy to try and work out why this happened and to try and help me to overcome it using techniques. and I wanted, when I was younger, to be an actor. That was my dream. And I kind of gave up on that dream because of the stammer, because I didn't like the stammer. I'm sure that it would be perfectly possible for me to do it, and I actually have, I know of actors who have stammers, who have absolutely great careers. But it affected me in such a way that it stopped me from being able to do that. This kind of inheritance is what I want to talk about today. So this is what Alfred North Whitehead, the process philosopher, would call a root of inheritance. I'll speak at a bit more length about what a root of inheritance is a bit later on. I just wanted to kind of give you a little story to begin with, to kind of lead into it. This idea of roots of inheritance is going to lead into a theory of collective creativity in Larping. You probably don't see how that's going to happen at the moment from a story about me stammering when I was 13, but it will, trust me. And as I've said, this idea is underpinned by Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy of organism. And kind of the main idea is that creativity in collaborative story making can be understood in terms of the givenness of roots of inheritance. And so I'm going to be talking a bit about this idea of what we give, what is given to a Larp, and how everything that is given to a Larp scene in particular, Larp characters as well, these all have roots of inheritance that come with them. So they've all been inherited from the past. So I'm going to talk a bit about this idea of givenness and how givenness is determination, but it's also kind of a gifting. So a gifting of the past. So even though we think of this idea of determination as kind of, something which is, I don't know. So if we say something is predetermined, then we tend to think of that as not having potential. It's fixed in some way. But Alfred North Whitehead thinks in a slightly different way, and that when something is determined, it becomes potential for something else. So from that fixity, from it being a fixed idea, in fact, the only way we can be creative is by acknowledging the fixed ideas that we already have, and the things which we've inherited from our past. And it's only by acknowledging those things and recognising the potential inherent in those things that we can start to think creatively. And I'm going to talk about a character as roots of inheritance. So this idea that a Larp character is entirely made up, it's entirely constituted by roots of inheritance. It's nothing but roots of inheritance. And I'm going to introduce this idea of scening and storying as well. So instead of talking about scenes and stories as objects, talking about scening and storying as processes. thinking about givenness first of all. And I want to take this room as an example. So this, we experience this room. So we perceive it with our eyes, with our bodies. Alfred North Whitehead would say he's the first kind of post-human philosopher, and he would say that the room also experiences us. So everything is subjective. So everything that exists in the world has subjectivity. It's not just humans that have subjectivity, it's everything. So I experience the chair that I'm sitting on. I experience the air. I experience the light. But I experience, seeing the walls. I experience feeling the floor underneath me supporting me. But at the same time, Alfred North Whitehead would argue that that these things are all experiencing us as well. The floor, the walls, and the ceiling. Unless I decide to take a hammer to them, they're not gonna. It's gonna kind of their experience of me is going to be quite vague. It's not going to affect them much. I'm not particularly, I don't have much meaning for them. Whereas the air and the light, so the light is reflecting off my skin. I have an effect on the light in this room. We all do. Everything in the room has an effect on the light. The same with the air. So I'm breathing. Every time I breathe, I draw in oxygen. I convert it into carbon dioxide in my cells, and so therefore I am having a real effect on the air. The heat that I produce from my body is also having an effect on the temperature of the air, of how it moves in space. So this idea that we are not kind of just these subjects who are taking everything in, we are also objects for all of the other subjects which are in the world. And that we can think of this room in a what is called a methectic way. Methexis means participation. It's just a Greek word for participation that Plato used. And it kind of incorporates the idea of togetherness. So everything in the room together makes the room, including us. So we're not kind of immersed in the room, we are part of the room while we are here. And we affect it in particular ways. We affect the air which is in it, we affect the light. This idea of roots of inheritance is simply the idea that it's a pathway traced through the history of everything. So a ray of light which comes from the light fixtures in the ceiling, bounces off the carpet and goes into my eye. That is a root of inheritance. And Alfred North Whitehead would say that it's a similar kind of process, that root of inheritance of the ray of light bouncing off the carpet and into my eye is a similar root of inheritance to my stammer and how that's affected me in my life. So he doesn't differentiate between physical, a physical root of inheritance and a mental root of inheritance. In fact, everything has both physicality and mentality. And in fact, all of the hormones which are released in my body when I get anxious about stammering, they are a physical effect. Although they're triggered by something mental, they are a physical effect. And he would say that equally, the stream of light particles which hits my eye after bouncing off the carpet also has some kind of mentality to it. It's a subjective thing. And then, so existing theories of participation. So I'm thinking about people like Adam Alston, who writes about immersive theatre, Marjuka Lampo, who has written about affordances, so the idea of affordances. So we as subjects see things in a particular way. So I see this as a table and it's for something. So it gives me certain affordances. I can do certain things with this table. I can do certain things with this chair, and another kind of organism would see this table and this chair in a very different way. So a mouse wouldn't see this as a table and wouldn't see this as a chair. It has different affordances for the mouse as it does for me, because of the way I'm physically built and the way the mouse is physically built. And this comes from a guy called James Gibson, who spoke about affordances and kind of the way we perceive the world as these objects, and which are useful for something. But so the argument I want to make is basically that these existing theories think about what we take from things. So how can I use this table? I don't think about what it gives to me or what I give to it. The affordances are all about how I can use it, how I can take something from it. It doesn't think about me in another kind of relation to the table in which we are reciprocal. So kind of extant theories on participation and play neglect the idea, so what we give to things, and this idea of methectic incorporation of things in the world. And so that's kind of where I want to go with this. So I'm going to tell you another story now about me LARPing this time, so it's going to be probably more relevant to you than a story about me stammering. So I played in a LARP called Conscience in Spain in this February just gone. It's based on the HBO series Westworld. So it's set in a theme park where robots, these sex robots, are there for the pleasure of the guests, and I played one of those guests. I am a gay Englishman, and I was playing an American businessman who had a wife and children, and I played him as straight. I mean, it would be possible to play that character as a closeted man, possibly, but I played him as straight. And so, kind of the roots of inheritance that I have in my life are those of an Englishman who grew up in southwestern England. They are the roots of inheritance of a gay man who grew up in a majority straight world, who, battled with questions of sexuality and identity in my youth, where perhaps my character hadn't. I have never run a multinational business, so that root of inheritance isn't something that is in my history. And so it's kind of the question of where does that come from? Where do I decide what that character is when I'm not American, when I don't have children, when I'm not straight, and I don't have an embodied knowledge of what it is to run a business. And kind of the way I see it, so how I built the character, I drew on things such as all of the straight people who I know. So, which is a lot of people, particularly the straight men, obviously, because I was playing a man. So there's a lot of material for me to draw on there, and it's kind of direct experience there, where I can draw on behaviours that I've observed. I can think about how I've seen those straight men relate to other people. Obviously in public, I could never have a private experience of what it is to be a straight man. I've had 2 long-term partners, and so kind of that idea of spousehood is something that I could draw on from my own personal experience. Though obviously not kind of from a straight perspective, and I don't have personal experience of the dynamics of a straight relationship. I've never had children, but I know lots of people who have had children, and so again I can draw on experiences where I've observed people with their children, although I could never have that personally embodied experience of that. Probably the most difficult thing was the Americanness and the idea of being a businessman. I do have American friends. I have more now since being here, so that's nice. But I spent 4 months here in Boston, actually. I studied at what was then Bridgewater State College. It's now Bridgewater State University, which is just down the road from here. So I did have some kind of idea about Americanness, but there, I didn't. The majority of my idea of what it is to be American comes from TV shows and films. And so those are the roots of inheritance that I draw on when I'm thinking about this character, and even more so for the businessman aspect of this character. I don't know anyone, I don't have any friends who run multinational corporations. And so I am I'm making assumptions about who this person is. I'm closing down some possibilities of what they could be because of preconceptions that I have about people who run multinational corporations, and those preconceptions have come mostly from films and television. Wow.
That's the number of slides we're on.
And so yeah, all these roots of inheritance, some of which have come from different places, so some of which have come from direct experience, some of which have come from portrayals on TV and films, some of which have come from observation of relationships between people. The character, I invested all those things in the character. I also took what was on the character sheet. That is a root of inheritance as well. So I don't try and faithfully recreate what is on the character sheet. I take the character sheet as a root of inheritance, and me and the character sheet come together methectically, so we participate with each other in this process of character. And so that's kind of the image. So the image is not of me immersed in a character, it's me kind of together with the character. So that we're kind of inseparable. And that character didn't exist before, it wasn't on the character sheet. The character sheet was simply root of inheritance, which allowed me to come to this kind of state of togetherness. So this idea of integration of roots of inheritance, and that's what the character is. I'll quickly go over these ideas of scening and storying then. So this is basically, the idea of scening is it's the process of making a scene. And so each of the characters, which is a kind of an agglomeration of roots of inheritance, so each of the characters which is involved in a scene offers those roots of inheritance into the process of the scene. So that becomes, so the scene itself kind of becomes the subjective object, which is feeling all of these characters. So we're not individually. So what I'm arguing for here is kind of a two-part process. So the scening, which is the objectification of the characters and the players in the scene as a subjective object. Or a subjective object doesn't make any sense. as a subject. And then each of the players then takes that scene as an object. So each of the subjectivities of the players takes that object of the scene into their own narrative. And that kind of explains how the singular scene can give rise to multiple narratives. And that scene then, having drawn all these roots of inheritance, becomes a root of inheritance itself. And actually becomes part of you as a subject. So the scene kind of exists within you, and will continue to exist within you as a player, and afterwards. So we get the idea of bleed is because those things are participating in you all the time. And you are drawing on your prior experiences all the time. They are participating, they are not representations, they're not kind of a later embodiment of an original idea. They are actually, they actually exist inside you. So I'll quickly wrap up now. So this idea of this oscillating process of scening and storying. So the creativity arises from the givenness of the determined elements of Larping. So the players and the characters as roots of inheritance, the design of the Larp, all of these things which we give to the scene, and then we take all of those things which happened in the scene, so as a single object, into our narrative. So let's skip through all of this. So this idea that creativity in collaborative storymaking can be understood in terms of the givenness of roots of inheritance, and then the kind of findings from all of the different slides. So we can consider that what we give to a Larp is its potentiality. So the design document, the character sheets, our own prior experiences as players, all build up into a Larp. So these things are all potentials. So they are just potential, even though they're given and they're already determined, they are potentials for something new to happen. which is what Larping is. It's this kind of togetherness of these roots of inheritance in a creative way. That was a really bad word to end on.
So we have some time left for questions from the audience. Open the floor, and we'll take, 5 questions? Oh, 5 or 6 questions. Okay. We'll see how long the questions are. I'll start there, and I saw a hand over there as well.
Yes. I have a question about Pacific Northwest Aggregate Larp. I was really... there seems to be a missing step in how things become rules. So it sounded like originally it was designed by committee in a central location in New England, and you had these giant rule books.
Right.
And then it became distributed. Players were proposing rules, and the rule books got a lot shorter. What's the schoolhouse rock how a bill becomes a law for how the rules suggested by players actually get approved or disapproved? Because I am shocked that it created a smaller rule. If you got far more people who got the power to propose rules. Sounds like there's a really big choke point there.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. And it's interesting. It's like I sort of worked on the co-creation of the structure for creating rules before the game started, and I was the telegraph operator for the first game, so I got to be that weird NPC. They got to watch how everything was playing out. So I should say that there are some amazing people who are part of that community who can speak more eloquently than I about how the process evolved over the 2-year run of the game, which I only watched from afar. But based on my experience, working with the design team and watching, that first run of the game and then seeing how the game played out. Well, for better or worse, one thing about, aggregate versus authorial LARP, every LARP is aggregate. Every LARP is democratic in some way. Everyone co-creates stuff. Your character's actions matter. Every person participating in the LARP creates part of the story. And it's when it's all right, Pacific Northwest Aggregate LARP, we make things more aggregate, but we still had a central committee that decided, a centralized committee within our community, though, that was able to respond to direct player feedback, that decided, which rule proposals, became a law. So you would work with other players, workshopping your characters. There were multiple out-of-game workshops that were run in which folks would meet up. Some people have role-play only characters, some people have offer-based characters. They might just practice those types of play together while brainstorming what their characters might be and then come up with rules. So we make sure build in sessions in which people are sort of playing before they become creators. You're sort of training people to get into that creation mindset. They write the proposals up. Staff looks at them. Staff says, "Oh my gosh, that is not going to work," and gives it back to you, and you sort of revise it until it fits within the system. So there was effort to make sure that things didn't become overwhelming for new players. Because you don't want to have a situation in which you create this nebulous body of rules, so someone who walks in 6 months later is just whoa, there's a million things to memorize. One of the mitigation factors was just ending the game after a year, or ending the game after 2 years. All of the rules have been co-created, go back to zero. It's like a debt jubilee. It's okay, or a wealth jubilee or something, where it's all right, we're gonna start over again in an equal playing field. But yes, one of the problems of that type of game is you still have certain levels of hierarchy that could arise when someone who'd been playing for a while just knew all of the interesting rules that people had created within the game culture. And there's only so much work you can do to mitigate that in the diegetic commodity style of game. But, so you can do your best. There's always more you can do, or you can just do a different style of LARP. So,
So the roots of inheritance.
Yes.
When talking about designing your character, the example character that you provided, you mentioned drawing on your experience of others or having observed others, and also how you also drew from media in places on that. Is the point of that to be able to design differently, or to critique or examine after the fact differently, by having a different system by which you're viewing the whole process?
I guess the point I'm trying to make is that the character that I made was partly based on stereotypes and ideas that I have about those things, and trying to recognise where I think, but my research is very much about representation in LARPing, and this idea of roots of inheritance is about investigating how we are representing. So how am I representing an American, and what am I drawing on in order to do that? And so it's a way of critiquing my own prejudices, my own preconceptions, and my own assumptions, and thinking about thinking about my preconceptions about what business people are like, as an academic and as an artist. I have certain preconceptions about what business people are like, and I just assume that all business people are like this, and it's just not true, and I think in playing that character, I did make him initially very kind of my preconception of a business person, but through playing him and through creating new roots of inheritance in myself through playing the character, came to realise that he's a lot more like me than I thought he was. We share a lot more than in our views of the world than I had initially thought, and I think that's a really powerful thing, that LARPing can build roots of inheritance in us as well. That the LARP continues to live inside us after we've played. These characters continue to stay with us afterwards, and can change our perspectives on things.
The character you played had lots of axes of privilege, and that was just sort of a coincidence of the character you had. How do you think, or have you thought about the same process if you were playing a character that shared several intersections of marginalization that you don't necessarily share? And how would that affect that process?
I mean, and this is a really interesting idea for my research, particularly because how do people who like a white Englishman who clearly has a lot of privilege, if I was to play someone from an ethnic minority with perhaps more obvious disabilities than I have, then do I have sufficient do I have a sufficient understanding through the roots of inheritance that I have to portray that in a sensitive way? And this is part of what I'm grappling with, actually. I don't have an answer to that at the moment, but I hope to by the end of my thesis.
I hope so too.
I feel like I want to piggyback on some of those concepts, and just I really admire and I'm excited about this effort to really thoughtfully describe what it means to play a character and what it means to scene or create a scene. It seemed like you were scening as a verb, so scening, and in the panel earlier on bleed, one of the topics discussed was emancipatory bleed, in which, you know, folks who have levels of oppression, Larp, and have an experience afterwards in which they become more aware of their own oppression through reflecting and writing via autoethnography about their experience. And I guess I wonder how useful do you think Whitehead might be to creating reflections like that, for folks who are marginalized?
I mean, I think Whitehead has a lot to offer. He writes explicitly, like, according to him, everything is experience. Everything, you know, reality is composed of experience, and that's what we're doing in Larping, is experiencing things, and kind of creating. Yeah, I think the idea of roots of inheritance could be. It has the potential to enter into that. This idea of emancipatory bleed. You know, I think it kind of is explanatory of bleed and explanatory of trauma as well. The idea that trauma symptoms are not representations. They are the actual participation of the original trauma experience in you now. And a trauma symptom is an actual reliving of trauma, of the original trauma experience, rather than a representation of it. And so I think that notion can be really powerful in thinking about kind of notions of trauma.
Of course, it's interesting to not all our communities acknowledge bleed, you know, and that trauma that can be evoked.
Yeah.
I had a question for you, Samara. You alluded early in your talk to using the things you were studying in Larp for other non-Larp decision-making bodies or methods or whatever. I'm curious if you've been able to make that translation at all yet, and if so, how, or how would you see it? How would you see it working?
Well, I guess like the biggest you know, moment of translation is, you know, just the statement that, you know, governmental decision making is a way of co-creating diegesis, and by saying that and by sort of fighting for that in my academic work, it becomes a way to hopefully start conversations about how their decision-making may be thought of as a participatory media form. What are its aesthetics? To what degree has decision-making truly been rendered democratic or aggregate within a process? To what degree do you lose the quality of, you know, aggregation when certain factors may be prohibitive to either coming to the table or having your concerns even, you know, voiced as something that may be decided upon. So, you know, there's a lot of work yet to be done, but I'm very interested in just sort of kind of playfully, you know, working with this framework to let us start having these cross-medium conversations between Larpers and legislatures.
Thank you.
Is that another note?
Oh, no, this is just a head scratch.
I kind of, this is a question sort of for both of you, but you know, I'm sort of hearing your talks about the sort of paths that lead to the experience of a Larp and each person's experience of a Larp. How much games have a unified diegesis versus a divided diegesis based on each person's experiential factors coming into it, and If so, do you design it, like, should the game be designed around having a fragmented diegesis or unified?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the idea of scening and storying are kind of like the two sides of that coin.
Yeah.
So the scening is the unification of everything in a single scene, and then the storying is the fragmentation of it and the diversity of stories that come out of that unification. I think that what was it somebody said earlier? There are no plans that come out of come out unaffected by the players.
Yeah.
Players always bring something new. You can't plan. You can design. And I think we always have to design for the assumption that there are going to be multiple narratives that come out of this. There's not going to be a single unified version of the Larp. There are only going to be partial, fragmentary, individualized versions of the Larp.
And I guess to piggyback off of that, as someone who has played the fragmented Diegesis game that Evan designed, in terms of, acknowledging it or structuring it or, building that into discourse of expectations. I guess as a cultural theorist, I always want to get to the antidote or the thing, the moment of culture that is being visualized that we're building theory off of. So there's that moment when you're playing Port of Secrets and something has been happening in the room you're in, and out on the porch something else happened, and you realize there are literally two different story worlds going on, and in one of those story worlds the mayor is dead, and am I representing this correctly? The mayor is dead, and the town hall's on fire, and the mafia is holding someone hostage, and in the other version of the story, that all of that hasn't happened, and there's just a gala going on, and and the mayor is actually on vacation and completely fine, and so it's a very
how do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, it was funny because after the game, I was having issues with it, and other people who weren't used to this were kind of well, and then some people were really surfing the wave because it's kind of like a Rick and Morty episode where you're just okay, all the realities are colliding at once. This matches my thinking style, and I guess something that you kind of do with that to reconcile is just decide as a player constantly, you're constantly saying, wait a sec, I kind of like that reality better where the mayor's dead. I'm just going to hop into that one, and the reality I was just in that other room, no longer exists. So other players might come up to me and try to evoke that reality, but it's gone now.
And presumably neither of those alternate realities is privileged over the other. So there's no way that you can say, well, this one was true and this one was the lie.
Yeah. So frequently a situation happens where it's between one player can think, say I'm one player doesn't think that we're related, but everyone else in the room thinks we're related. Is it true? Who knows? But that's why I think it in some ways having a fragmented game world simulates reality better because, as we all know from looking at politics, no one actually agrees on what reality is in the real world either.
This is Whitehead's metaphysics, is that basically reality continues to there's a constant creativity simply because nothing agrees with each other. If we had perfect harmony, then everything would just stop. It would be fixed, that would be determined, and that would be it. But it's because nothing is in agreement, because there's this unity of disharmony that everything has to keep going.
We are formally out of time.